My name is Stewart Norman. I work as a fisheries consultant and Marine Stewardship Council technical consultant also. I'll be talking to you today about the process of undertaking a marine MSC pre-assessment for the Southwest Indian Ocean octopus fisheries and the critical information that's required to get through that process and some of the outcomes that we discovered whilst we undertook the process in 2018. The main aim of SWIOCeph, and I didn't come up with this, but it is to assist octopus fishing communities in the Southwest Indian Ocean region towards more sustainable fishing practices. Of course, that's the main aim. Secondary or knock-on effects of a certified sustainable fishery, if the goal was ever to be achieved, is of course improved market access and benefits for the fishing community themselves, who shift their practices to reflect global sustainability best practice. So the core aim, but leads to a whole lot of associated benefits. So what we did was canvassed octopus fisheries in the region. And as you can see on this map, what we have was, you can see the term UOA, that's a unit of assessment. So that would be an individual fishery defined by the Marine Stewardship Council, and I'll get into that. But you could see that we focused on the southwest coast of Madagascar. We looked at Mozambique and Tanzania, Zanzibar separately to Tanzania, Kenya, and then also South Africa right down at the bottom, but I won't really speak to that, and I'll explain why later. The interesting thing that we did here was, if you look at unit of assessment 6, it's a grouped unit of assessment that we defined as a regional overarching similarities between those individual communities, and we scored them as a grouped regional unit of assessment. Also for various reasons relating to information availability, where we would struggle to find specific information about a community, it was often useful to bring similarities together and score as a grouped unit. And I'll show those results later. In our assessment, we focused on octopus cyanea, and we also need to bound the fishery by the management authority, be that local community management or national governance. That's also one of the components that ring fences the unit of assessment. And the fishermen themselves, who is actually fishing. So whilst canvassing these octopus fisheries in the region, this was actually a very tricky part of the project. Almost before we'd even gotten started with the pre-assessment, we had to trying to ring fence an artisanal or small scale fishery with multiple fishing communities all targeting the same resource was actually probably the fundamental starting point of the process, and effectively it was the first stumbling block, and that led to troubleshooting throughout the remainder of the process. So I'm going to go into that a little bit in my next slide, and I've got up here the preparation that we had to do to identify the fishery stakeholders. So this specifically sums up, although it's specific to Madagascar, the sort of aspects that we needed to define along the way. So the main governing government management authority, although these are small-scale fisheries for octopus, the National Management Authority plays an important role with respect to the overarching fishery policies, overlapping fisheries, and an octopus fishery doesn't take place in a vacuum. There's often other industrial fisheries influencing the resource, lionfish fisheries. Also, the Management Authority may or may not license fishers and play some sort of compliance function or conflict resolution function. You've also got industry, And when I say industry, I mean the processes, typically when we speak about octopus fisheries, because it's the octopus processor that has access to the market and effectively transports from very rural locations to the consumer, and they facilitate the cold chain and are a critical component of understanding the nature of the fisheries in the region. And then the fishers themselves and the community representatives. So at the ground level, the fishing communities are generally self-governed, or in some cases they're managed collectively, and issues are generally resolved locally, although I mentioned the overarching governance. But basically what happens on the ground, that's the hotspot. And it's the fishers and the fishing areas, the gear that they use. There's multiple different types of gear, multi-species fisheries. An individual fisherman may be a specialist in octopus fishing, but may also be a specialist line fisherman, but trying to identify who is actually targeting octopus in each of these communities is a very important aspect of defining the unit of assessment. On the slide, you can also see that we talk about habitat and fishing areas. We talk about seasonality. We talk about closed areas, which is obviously very pertinent to octopus fisheries. But what we found was seasonality and weather was probably one of the main determining factors about when and where somebody goes fishing. And then the closed seasons are typically scheduled actually around weather. So it's working with the natural environment. And that's almost, you need to know all of that before you even start. And that was quite tricky, actually, trying to box these very almost varied fisheries and unique community situations into the Marine Stewardship Council paradigm. So what does that actually look like? The Marine Stewardship Council standard, and probably most of you are quite familiar with this now, having been exposed to myself when I was visiting, and to various other sort of proponents of the MSC. But effectively, we're looking at the stock and the species that we're targeting. We're looking at the health of the stock and how it's managed, whether or not there are any harvest control rules and tools used or applied in the fishery that impacts that stock health or stock status. And then, very importantly, the MSC is a sort of ecosystem approach, and it takes account of what else is caught by octopus fishers when they go catching octopus. Are there any bycatch or associated catch species? And then specifically, there's always a focus on endangered, threatened, and protected (ETP) species. Is there a IUCN-rated vulnerable species or critically endangered species that is also happens to be harvested by octopus fishers, and to what extent? Habitats, the coral reef habitats that octopus associate with are typically fragile. So what damage or is done to those habitats, if any, and what protection measures are in place to prevent that happening? And how do you sustain the habitat so that you can sustain the resource? And then the overarching ecosystem and the interactions between each of those components. Then principle 3 focuses on governance, both the overarching governance that I mentioned. Is it in place? Does that country have a policy in place, a Fisheries Act, some regulation that determines, that states we would like sustainable resource harvesting for generations to come, or not? I mean, and most do. So it doesn't focus on the specific community. But then when we look at the fishery management system, we're looking for specific management plans, specific ways and stakeholders and engagement, and how the fishery is actually managed on a day-to-day basis. So sort of 2 levels of governance are the focus. And I'm going to dive into sort of each one of those, obviously in the light of what we discovered during our pre-assessment process. So the stock. Now it's difficult to assess the status or health of a resource that you can't see. You're not walking into a forest and counting birds or elephants or livestock in a kraal or in a farm or something. So first we had to identify which species was being caught. And then we looked for local and regional stock assessments. What information was out there to inform us scoring each of these different fisheries? And importantly, with octopus, it was trying to work out, well, what influence does one community have on another? Because they don't just sit in one place. Octopus larvae are broadcast through currents, and you have source and sink dynamics throughout the Southwest Indian Ocean region. Where overcatch in one place may lead to undercatch in another, or undercatch in one place may lead to a boon of octopus for another community. One of the metrics that we use to assess this is a catch per unit effort. Basically, how much octopus was being caught 10 years ago, 5 years ago, and now, to try and determine what the status of the stock was. But then you also have to look at how many fishermen were fishing then, how were they fishing, what's changed, what dynamics of the operation have changed, be it augmented by vessels being able to transport fishermen to further offshore reefs. Would that lead to higher catches, diving deeper, or simply just more fishermen and more days being fished? So that was quite difficult, being that oftentimes a study done 10 years ago looked at different metrics. So being able to compare or find commonalities between the different studies that have taken place can be tricky. And just, I suppose, in terms of catch monitoring, to really realize that not all catches can be monitored. But so long as that representative subsample of information can be provided during this process, you can sort of extrapolate that information up and down a coastline, or from one community to another, as long as you find those similarities. And so that's step one, looking at the stock. Looking at the ecosystem, there's a few integral components that information is required about to understand the impact on the ecosystem. As I mentioned already, targeted fishing, where an individual will only catch octopus, or mixed species fishing. And then again, are using single gear or many gears taken out on a fishing outing. And what's the selectivity of that gear? We know that a harpoon or a hook stick for octopus is going to catch only that octopus, but we know that gillnet fishermen or line fishermen might catch, would catch significantly more species, and that would influence the impact, obviously, on the ecosystem, specifically bycatch or primary and secondary species. So ETP species I mentioned in the region, that includes marine turtles, certain shark species, and then specifically with relation to octopus fishes is the impact that they may or may not be having on some of the ETP sea cucumber species, which are very easy to harvest by hand and occur in overlapping or similar areas to where the octopus are found. So what impact if any, is happening on those ETP species? I think a major improvement over time that we saw, at least were informed about, was the recognition that preservation of the habitat is critical to future harvesting opportunities. So reef trampling and damage to the reef through trying to extract an octopus from a deep hole has sort of tailed off. And that's simply an education initiative informing octopus fishers about, if you want to find an octopus in that hole next time, the hole needs to be there. And those conservation programs and really can inform the pre-assessment process, because somebody's gone out, engaged with the fishermen, found out what they're doing, and then, you know, gone back in 5 years' time. These punctual research studies that I'm referring to here, follow a fisherman now, see how it's going, put in place a conservation program, come back in 5 years' time and see what's changed, and hopefully for the better. And we found that in most cases, especially with relation to the habitat preservation, the change had been good. Governance was a tricky one. Oh, sorry, here you go. I've got some pictures of octopus habitat, more zoomed in. Damaged habitat on the bottom right, and then some sea cucumber species on the top right. And as I was moving into there, governance was relatively tricky and complex. In a small scale community, a fishing community, the distance from the national regulator to the remote location where fishing taking place often means that by the time the national regulator is even informed or aware of an issue, it's been resolved one way or the other. So although that overarching legislation needs to be in place to guide national policies and ensure some sort of future security for fishers and investors even, normally in the form of National Fisheries Act, in actual fact, it's the community-specific management that really needs to be unpacked to understand how or if the fishery is managed effectively, and effectively being according to the Marine Stewardship Council version of that and guidance about that. So we found that although fisheries licensing is a very useful mechanism of controlling a fishery, and it also can be very useful to understand the amount of effort that's being applied in each of the fisheries, it generally only works if there's on-the-ground compliance with that licensing system. And we found mostly that authority rested in that compliance sense with community representatives. And for the most part, control was in the form of self-regulation, the community understanding what it takes to have a sustainable fishery, and then almost self-regulating within that community and ensuring that everybody's on board on the same sort of management plan. It seemed to be more effective than the remote national responses, but it was really important that the guiding principles of that self-management then were in line with sustainable practice. It's no good everybody self-regulating against a management plan that is in 10 years' time going to lead to a devastated resource. The management plan and self-regulation needs to be aware of and in favor of ecological targets and sustainability rather than simply maximum harvest of the resource. So we found that generally where there's an agreed upon fishery specific management plan that could link the national sort of overarching goal with actual fishermen and the community circumstances, that it was possible to score well under this principle 3 and each of the performance indicators under principle 3. So those are the 3 overarching aspects of a fishery that we would be focusing on for scoring. But in saying that, there are some cross-cutting issues that basically broadly are involved in each principle 1, 2, and 3. And you'll see the first that I mentioned here is compliance and enforcement. That relates to the number of fishers, how much they fish, where and when they fish, and what impact that has on the resource. So that's your principle 1 part there. And if it's a free-for-all and there's no compliance and enforcement, you're going to feel that on principle 1. What harvest control rules are in place, but not just which ones are in paper, which ones are actually enforced. And is there some confidence that the community is sticking to those rules? And it also, again, that influences principle 2. You might have a management plan in place to reduce the amount of bycatch, but if there's no surety that a fishing community or an individual fisherman even is following that rule and reducing their bycatch or not damaging the reef, or making sure that he isn't occasionally, instead of finding an octopus, encounters an endangered shark or even a sea turtle and is bringing that home instead on what was initially an octopus outing. There has to be some sense of reporting and compliance with those rules. So traceability is the next one. And it can be seen as the chain of ownership, from the reef where the octopus is all the way through to the consumer's plate of food in Europe, and everything in between. So this is obviously why it's a cross-cutting topic. The catch collectors often source catch from multiple fishers before selling it onto the processing factory and their representatives. What does the cold chain look like between the beach and the factory? And then, of course, there's also the internal processes within the factory, and they're important, and it needs to be clear from which region or reef the octopus was caught. And often that bottleneck point influences actually what kind of octopus is coming into the factory, what octopus are they looking for. And transparency is required here. So the MSC needs to know that there's a guarantee that when catch leaves the factory in a frozen box, they need to know where that octopus came from. Did that come from which community? When was it caught? What size was it? Is it in line with the regulations about size limits? So again, the traceability is almost like a bird's eye viewpoint of the entire process. And if it's understood correctly, then it actually can inform each of principle 1, 2, and 3 scoring. So decision-making responsibilities, again, that's linked to all 3 principles. Who's responsible on the ground, in the community? Who are the key stakeholders that actually drive the fishery and create incentive for fishing? What are the incentives to determine where and when to fish and how the catch reaches that local and international marketplace? Who's making those decisions? And who are the scientists also behind the research? Who's undertaking the stock assessments? So we found that obviously in the region, there are a lot of NGOs that have been active, and they've been there actually long enough now to have gotten to a place of genuine understanding of the pressures faced by each of the communities, and they can relate also and translate those external forces driving the decision making. So they're a very useful source of information during this process. So yeah, in terms of cross-cutting topics, mapping out the traceability chain, understanding what drives the decisions at each point of handover, and finally having faith that the management in place actually exists beyond an attractive white paper document is one of the best ways to inform the MSC assessment and reach that best practice score that everybody's looking for against the MSC standard. And that's what it looks like. So the MSC is basically broken down into 3 categories, which is, I suppose, simply the traffic light system of red, orange, and green. Red being a fail against the standard, not meeting the minimum acceptable performance metrics or guidance laid out by the standard. But of course, fisheries in transition, and usually fisheries that are undertaking a pre-assessment, don't expect to be at best practice. They hope not to fail or score less than 60. They've got some management in place and the stock's relatively healthy. But they're not quite there. They're not at global best practice. And we found this a lot, but the MSC is aware of this. And a conditional pass score between 60 and 80 is possible and common. And what it basically says is, you're not quite there yet. And then a condition can be set that says, this is how to get there. And in some instances, we did find scores that were above 80, where the stock is really healthy. And a recent stock assessment shows us that. The information's there to really inform the scoring. And that's really what it's about. It's about that information being available to to score each of the performance indicators at either less than 60, 60 to 79, or greater than 80. Less than 60 being it's a non-starter, really. And I'm going to dive into a few of the results that we uncovered, just sort of very broadly, and I'll link some of the similarities. So we looked at, like you saw from that map, we looked at Southwest Madagascar, Kenya. We broke down into North and South, being that there were different regimes of governance and different fishing tactics in the north and south. Zanzibar, mainland Tanzania, Mozambique, Comores, the Seychelles, and Mauritius. We grouped Mozambique, Comores, Seychelles, and Mauritius because of the information sparsity, okay, in those areas. And also just to note that the 4,482 tons of octopus caught in Mozambique would probably, we found that wasn't all a single species, all caught by the same means. But that was the sort of degree or level of information that we had. And you can see also there the year that information or those catches relate to, some going all the way back to 2013, was the best or most recent information, which also led us to determine who we'd be scoring. So basically, the MSC process or the pre-assessment process at least, is a gap analysis. Where are you now, versus where you want to get to, and those conditional pass scores can be very informative. And what I've got up here on the slide is effectively the best case scenario that we found in the region. And you can see a lot of green and a lot of orange, and fortunately no red. Although I will highlight that the sort of striped boxes are the question marks, right? Which could be scored where more information would be needed to actually have a very confident orange or red or green outcome there. But as you can see, if you've got a good stock status, you generally, in order to have a green score under stock status, you would have had to have had good information and a good assessment, right? So there you can see how those are linked. And then there were some rules in place, and harvest control rules and a strategy in place, which basically effectively lead to a positive outcome, but that they could be better defined and understood, I suppose. Hence why there's still room for improvement there. It's not all green. Under the environment, ETP species were something of a concern, and I'll have you know that information is critical. When you've got poor information about, you're going to get a poor outcome score. So that was really important, and understanding exactly what the management plans were, and if there was a management plan specific to ETP species. Secondary and primary species, we found the octopus fishery basically is very species specific, if it's an octopus specialist, okay? So really there are not that many primary species being managed bycatch species. Secondary species are unmanaged bycatch species. So really, you've got all greens under primary because there are no managed bycatch species in these fisheries, and that can create an automatic positive score. But there under secondary, there are a few more question marks. Habitat information we found was quite good, but again, historically or even currently, there's been quite a bit of damage to that habitat, and it's in some cases ongoing. So just making sure that the management plans in place to prevent that are all there. Again, here under the best case scenario, the overarching governance and policy, it's all there. The long-term objectives, who's involved, the decision-making responsibilities I was speaking about. But then a few more sort of question marks on the fishery-specific community level management plans and processes. And you'll see there quite a critical one that could this is the favorable best case scenario that was scored orange under compliance and enforcement, typically trying to unpack what does that actually mean at the community level, and how is the management plan, how can an assessor be assured that it's actually being enforced and is in place. And the next slide is the worst case scenario in the region, and you'll see there the only green is the primary outcome, and because there aren't actually primary managed bycatch species, and then the long-term objectives overarching under governance. But where there's no harvest strategy in place, where there's no rules or tools to manage how much effort is applied by a fishing community to a stock, it's more of that sort of on a needs basis, go and catch the species, as opposed to on a sort of ecological, sustainable basis. Again, the information's not there in some of these fisheries, some of these communities and regions. So, more information maybe would lead to a better score. And that applies throughout Principle 2 also. You can see it's the same scoring categories that are repeated under each component there. It's outcome, management, information. Information can inform the outcome. If you don't have information, you're going to score precautionary under outcome. You can't say for sure that it's positive. So you go for the precautionary approach. And then having a management plan in place. Ecosystem is a complex one. How do you manage the ecosystem? Basically, if you've got management for each of the other four, and it's then all tied together under one sort of overarching ecosystem management plan with each of those other components in place, that's a management plan for the ecosystem. I might be being quite vague here, but the Marine Stewardship Council provides a significant amount of guidance under each of these separate categories here, and as scored as performance indicators when I say categories. And under each of those performance indicators, there's scoring issues, very specific requirements to score at 60, at 80, and at 100. So we can dive far deeper into this, but I'm not going to here. And yeah, so Principle 3, again, also a lot of red, and that's whether or not there's a fishery-specific management plan in place. If there is, you'll probably identify your decision-making processes through that management plan, who's in charge of compliance and enforcement, and is that management plan actually ever reviewed, or was it, does it exist from 2010 and it's been applied, it hasn't been updated? Is there sort of performance review of how effective is that management? So this was the worst-case scenario, which would lead to an aggregate score of below 80 under each of these principles. And if you get an aggregate score of below 80, you're a non-starter against the standard. And there's sort of so much improvement to be done that, first get that started before even taking a look at the pre-assessment and the MSC standard. Just to quickly summarize maybe the overall results and shared strengths and weaknesses across each of the units of assessment. And I've left out South Africa here because that's a completely different harvesting technique and even a different species. But you can see stock status was generally all right, and that's a really positive aspect. But that the harvest strategies and control rules in place at each of these communities were scoring quite low and needed improvement. Again, management of the bycatch species was sometimes, across the board lacking. And then down at the fishery-specific management, is it there, and does it identify each of those different aspects? And we found that it didn't. So, in summary, the strength of a pre-assessment depends a lot on the people involved and the information available as an assessor. That's what we're looking at, and also understanding the requirements of the MSC standard. It is complex, and there's so many different layers to it. So really, digging into the nitty-gritty is our job, but being able to translate that to the stakeholders of the fishery is very important. And I'll leave it there. And basically, thanking Blue Ventures, who provided a lot of guidance, one of those entrenched NGOs in the region that really have a good grip on the fisheries and on the complexities of the actual fishery. And then the Marine Stewardship Council, and understanding the standard is equally complex. And the funders, the GIZ. Thanks very much for listening to my talk. I know that it's a very sort of broad overview of an intricate and complex process. If you have any more questions, I really do look forward to the Q&A session with you later. And I'll be very happy to unpack some of the specific issues that I discussed during this presentation. Thanks very much for listening.